Union opted to take power away from the political sphere and put it into institutions, and the result was chaos. Okay? So she argues that by keeping power within the political sphere, China avoided a lot of the chaos that the Soviet Union went through. Another approach worth pursuing is this idea of transitional institutions. And one of the big proponents of this is the Chinese economist Yin Chan, and he argues that that institutions in themselves are continually evolving. So the legal system, the economic institutions, markets, etc., these are continually evolving. And what you need to deal with is sort of transitional mechanisms that deal with problems as they arise. Okay? And the advantage of these is that they can be both efficiency enhancing, i.e. they can improve economic efficiency, and they can be compatible with the interests of those in power, in this case the Chinese Communist Party. So in a sense, he's saying that the idea of transitional institutions is a balancing act, okay, between pushing forward economic growth and keeping those in power happy. Okay? So these are essentially the 30 different theoretical perspectives that you can use to look at the reform process. I'm not saying they explain everything, and there's a lot of different points within them, but they certainly provide a very useful foundation for looking and trying to explain the way the reform of state-owned enterprises in China has progressed. Okay. I want to go back now to the start, in a sense, when we said there was a sort of a reform agenda and there was different issues which have determined that. And we said the first one was really the historical legacies that China has to deal with in reforming the state sector. So what I've given you here is essentially a table. There's no need to try to take down these figures. I'll make the slides available to you. But really, just to show you how quickly, after 1949, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, state-owned industry came to dominate the industrial landscape in China. Okay? So what I've given you is total industry output and the percentage share of each branch of industry. So the first one here is state-owned industry, the second one collectively owned industry, the third one is individually owned industry, and then other types of ownership. And you can see actually in 1952, before the planning process started, the industrial landscape in China was actually quite diverse. Okay, so state-owned industry accounted for about 40%, collectively owned industry about 3%, individually owned industry 22%, and other types of ownership 35%. So China's economy was actually quite diverse in 1952. Okay. That all started to change after the first 5-year plan, and really the first area to suffer was this individually owned industry, which went from about 22% down to about 0.8%. Okay? And the same with other types of ownership, 35% to 26%. The big gainer was obviously the state sector and the collective sector. Okay? The one we're interested in, which is the state-owned industry, you can see that throughout the first 5-year plan, the second 5-year plan, 1960s and 1970s, its share of industrial output gradually grew from about 41% in 1952 to 88% 10 years later. Okay? And by 1965, just before the Cultural Revolution, it was at over 90% of industrial output was commanded by the state sector. Okay? So even by 1978, when the economic environment had begun to get a little bit easier and become a bit more relaxed, the state still accounted for 78% of industrial output. Okay? So at the eve of reforms, the state had a very big role in the industrial output. What did this mean? Well, it meant that in 1978, China had a very disproportionate economic growth strategy that ultimately favoured heavy industry. And in putting this together, it went through a lot of different things. And the first sort of big push forward of heavy industry was a Great Leap Forward. Okay, so I presume you're all familiar with the Great Leap Forward. Okay, what it did in industrial terms was really try to push forward China's industrial effort by really pushing as much of the economy as possible into heavy industry. And that ranged from the idea of backyard furnaces, backyard smelters, but really the output of it was not that all impressive. And what it basically did was it motivated peasants to engage in industry, but a lot of these activities were not really industry at all. They were in fact very primitive industrial activities, and the return was very low. Okay? So the result was that China ended up with this high-cost, low-efficiency growth strategy and a catastrophic famine where, anywhere between 40 and 60 million people died. Okay? The situation was made worse after the Great Leap Forward by economic isolation. So not only was China isolated from the US because of the Korean War, it was also isolated from the Soviet Union following the Sino-Soviet dispute in 1960. And this was then followed by the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. And for enterprises, this meant that, it meant severe disruption to their management, to the targets that they were operating towards. A lot of them ended up being run by Red Guards, and it was quite a chaotic period for state enterprises. The upshot of all this is that really by the end of the Cultural Revolution, state enterprises and the state sector was not in a very good position. Technologically, it lagged the West by about 30 years. Its management structures had been destroyed and they were re-centralized afterwards. So the state sector was in quite a bad situation. However, you could look at this and say, in a sense, in trying to do what China was trying to do, it had very few alternative choices. Okay? So a lot of people ask, well, why did China pursue an industrial structure prior to 1978 that didn't maximize its comparative advantage in labor? Well, the answer is it couldn't have. Okay? Because comparative advantage is based on the ability to trade. Okay? And China had very few trade outlets. Okay? It couldn't trade in dollars, it couldn't trade in the Soviet Union. The only countries it could trade were Japan and through Hong Kong. Okay? So in a sense, the options it had were very limited. Again, if we look at the historical legacies, we can say that one of the legacies of the Cultural Revolution and the political persecution that occurred on an unprecedented scale is that the likelihood of serious political reform after 1978 was very, very small. Okay? Certainly Chinese society was unlikely to tolerate this type of change again. Okay? And the Chinese Communist Party's own version or own verdict on the Cultural Revolution as much as says that, saying that really it was a misguided experiment. It also meant the ending of voluntarism. And the idea of voluntarism where workers agree to sacrifice wage increases, everything they do is in the national interest. So it meant that voluntarism as a motivational force for enterprise management and their employees was no longer going to work. Okay? It also meant the end of mass movements and, as we said, the possibility of future political reform. The economy itself had essentially reached a plateau and needed something new to go forward. So Mao's big mistake was that, in a sense, he squeezed the peasants too hard. He demanded too much from them, he squeezed the economy too hard, and as a result, it reached a plateau where something new was needed. The only thing that China could do at the end of the 1970s, after the Cultural Revolution, was really revert to a model which it knew best, which was centralized control over the economy. However, what did change was this whole idea of, what drives the economy. So it was no longer ideology. So Deng Xiaoping in 1978 said in his sort of infamous statement, practice or what works should be the sole test of economic policy. The implication of that is that economic reforms from that moment on will be based on whether they worked, not whether they were ideologically consistent with the beliefs of the Chinese Communist Party. Okay? So that was a very big change. For state enterprises, it meant that things like labor productivity, profits, costs, all these issues suddenly became important. Okay? It also meant a number of changes, and we'll go through these individually. So we'll start with ownership, we'll go on to wage and labour reform, and then we'll look at corporate governance. The first big area we'll look at is ownership reform. So essentially, changing the ownership structure of state enterprises. And this involved really two specific policies. The first one was a transformation of state enterprises into limited liability companies, and the second was an optimization of their capital structure. Okay? So if we look at the first one, probably the biggest change was 1993, the company law. Okay? And this basically put in law the separation of government and business functions. Essentially, its idea was to encourage management to act in the interests of owners by allowing state-owned enterprises to become corporations, okay, to assume a corporate structure. And corporate structure essentially means that a corporation or an enterprise is a separate legal entity. It also allowed them to have limited liability, so limited liability for shareholders, a board of directors, and share capital. So they were allowed to raise share capital. Okay. What's interesting is that although this appeared quite a significant change on paper, in practice, corporatization didn't really imply any big change in ownership structure. So yes, it allowed state enterprises to become limited liability companies. It allowed them to adopt a corporate structure. It even allowed some of them, a very small select few in 1993, to list on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and later on Shanghai. But it didn't actually introduce any meaningful change in their structure. So even those enterprises that listed shares or that privatized only listed a very small proportion of their share capital. So on average, 10%, 10-15% to private shareholders. Okay. So although it seemed a very big change in practice, on paper, in practice it was actually quite a small change. The second area, and related, is it allowed them to optimize their capital structure. And it did this through reduced taxes on profits, accelerated rates of depreciation on fixed assets, and reduced rates of interest on loans. So in other words, very favorable financial conditions to put their houses in order. Okay. But again, even after these changes, the sort of equity distribution across state-owned enterprises, and when we mean equity, we mean capital, it was very unchanged. The big inefficient state enterprises didn't come out of this this process with less equity because they were less attractive to investors, actually the whole thing remained pretty much the same. Okay? In fact, a lot of the more efficient and larger state enterprises were the ones who gained most from this process. Okay? What it did change, in a sense, was over time, particularly after 1997, when we talked about this policy of grasping the large and letting go of the small, it did change the number of state enterprises. So even after 1993, so what I've given you here is the total number of industrial enterprises in China, followed by state-owned enterprises, collectively owned enterprises, individually owned enterprises, and other types of ownership. So you can see that even after 1993 and these initial ownership reforms, the number of state-owned enterprises continued to increase. So right up until 1997, when this policy of grasping the large and letting go of the small, right up to then, the numbers of state-owned enterprises continued to grow. Okay? It wasn't until after 1997 that the numbers actually started to decrease. Ownership reforms also meant corporate governance reforms. Okay, so if you reform the ownership, it means that essentially, you reform the corporate governance structure of enterprises. So there was a series of reforms in the 1980s and 1990s that sought to increase managerial motivation and bring the corporate structure of state enterprises very close to their Western counterparts. So that's what we talked about in the previous slides, a board of directors, shareholders, all of these things sought to essentially bring the corporate governance structure of state enterprises much closer to their Western counterparts. And there's a number of issues. We had state-owned enterprise law, 1988, the state-owned property regulations, 1994, again, company law, 1993. These all created the institutional foundations of a model based on three bodies: a shareholder general meeting, a board of directors, and a supervisory board. Essentially, a very similar structure, or very similar corporate structure to Western companies. This necessitated a gradual withdrawal of line bureau and ministries from asset management, and a political compromise which eventually led to the establishment of the State's Assets Supervisory Commission, which we talked about earlier. So even the creation of the SASAC was a political compromise in itself to allow ministries, to allow the political system gradually withdraw from enterprise corporate governance. Okay, do you normally take a break do you want me to keep going, or I'm not sure what the practice in Southampton is during a double lecture. Do you keep going? Lecture. Sorry? Depends on the lecture. Depends on the lecture. I'm happy to go and Southampton practice. I'll keep going if you want. Keep going. Okay. Okay. So the next area, which sort of really hit at the historical legacy side, was this issue of how to reform the labour system and wage reforms. So if you look at one of the fundamental obstacles to reform, it's the amount of control that state-owned enterprises give the political system, and in particular the Chinese Communist Party. And this control is known as the Iron Rice Bowl, whereby sort of workers essentially, in return for the state looking after their welfare, they contributed their labour. Okay, and it was called the Iron Rice Bowl. It was called the Iron Rice Bowl because there was viewed as very few escape options for workers. And this meant that some people actually termed it a mud rice bowl rather than an iron rice bowl because, you know, workers had relatively little choice about being part of this. Okay. And this iron rice bowl provided the state with one of its main sources of political power, so power over welfare. And Kroll argues essentially that political legitimacy, that the whole political legitimacy of party cadres was dependent on this welfare function. So if you take away this welfare function, the control over the party and officials essentially goes with it. That's basically saying if I no longer pay you, I no longer control you. Okay. The welfare function and its relationship to state-owned enterprises was also probably one of the last remaining means by which China could be termed as a socialist economy. Okay? So if you say, you know, the state no longer controls employment, or the state no longer gives employment through state-owned enterprises, well, how do you call China socialist? Okay? It no longer becomes a socialist economy if it no longer controls workers. Okay? So in a sense, what I'm saying is that this control over labour and the control over the wage system gave the party an enormous amount of power, which it wouldn't give up very easily. Okay. So the whole idea of reforming the labour system was extremely politically sensitive. It was even more sensitive for the fact that underpinning the whole sort of state enterprise structure was the large sacrifices that workers themselves had made, particularly during the period sort of 1949 to 1978, when they were told that essentially you behave in the national interest and we will look after your welfare. So, you know, the wages will be small, but what you're doing is in the national interest, and the payoff for that is we will look after your welfare. After 1978, productivity was introduced into this. So it was said, well, if you increase productivity, we will look after your welfare. But again, this only goes so far. So how can you continually increase labour productivity and maintain a large workforce? The easiest way to increase labour productivity is to reduce the workforce. Okay, so you get more output per worker. Okay. So in a sense, these sacrifices that the workforce of state enterprises made were based on the understanding that the state would take care of their welfare. And for much of its development, as we saw earlier on, workers had little choice but state enterprise employment. So reform introduced a big change to this relationship. And for workers, particularly in provinces such as Liaoning, that sort of really had a large dependence on state enterprise employment, it was often workers that turned out to be the main losers in the process. So the enterprises themselves gained, the state gained, but the workers lost. Okay. How did the state do this? Well, in 1978, it was obviously faced with a very big problem, namely, how do you differentiate workers by pay? Okay. For us, sitting in Southampton, you know, it's very easy to answer that question. You know, if you work harder, you know, if one of you works harder than the other, you pay more. Or you pay on output, you pay on performance targets. Prior to 1978, these structures didn't exist in Chinese state enterprises. So what was emphasized was equality of wage structure, self-sacrifice, voluntarism. Okay. After 1978, state enterprise management and the state itself had to figure out a way of how do you differentiate workers by pay. How do you, if you're going to say, we're now going to reward you based on productivity, how do we change the pay structures to reflect that? So there was a number of initiatives introduced in 1983, for example. New workers were put on 5-year rolling contracts. In 1986, you had the introduction of fixed-term contracts, usually three years in length, and you also had the introduction of bonus payments. Okay. But in a sense, these initiatives didn't really change much. So things like bonus payments became a normal part of workers' remuneration. Fixed-term contracts turned into long-term contracts, permanent contracts. 5-year rolling contracts turned into permanent contracts. So in a sense, enterprise management didn't really have either the will or the political autonomy to reduce the workforce. In the mid-1980s, there was moves to give them the power to reassign or take surplus workers out of production. But again, these changes didn't actually reduce the size of the workforce. Okay? They simply reassigned workers for training or take surplus workers out of production and continue to pay them. Okay? So this is a very big challenge. And as we said before, the situation didn't really fundamentally change until the large-scale privatization and hiving off of social functions after 1997. Okay? What's interesting about the change in 1997 is how quickly it was implemented. Okay? So, a lot of state enterprises went from a situation of increasing employment to literally halving their workforces overnight. And if you look at individual provinces, again we mentioned Liaoning before, the number of state workers in enterprises decreased from about 258 million in 1995 to 81 million in 2001. So that's an incredible reduction in the number of workers. Okay? Heilongjiang, 148 million to 50 million. Okay, and these are just two headline figures to show you the extent of what happened in 1997. Okay? So there was almost overnight, if you think of 5 years as a very short time scale, the number of state enterprise employees in sort of, particularly in provinces that really depended on state enterprise employment, fell by more than half. Okay? So again, you can see that, you know, in terms of the effect on urban state enterprise employment, you know, again, it grew up to 1997. So in 1996, you had 100 million. But basically, if you look at this bottom figure, you can see that, you know, state enterprise employment went from about 78% of total urban employment in 1978 down to about 40% of urban employment by 1999. And again, big change appears to have occurred in 1997. What did labour and wage reforms do? Well, and what didn't they do, more to the point? Although they were quite significant, they basically stopped short of giving management the outright freedom to fire workers. But you know, different pieces of research have shown that, you know, economic necessity often forced enterprises, particularly in heavy industry, to actually stop paying workers. More employees were accorded what became known as Zhagang status, which meant essentially they remained on the books of state enterprises, receiving a very low income, but not actually turning up for work. They were essentially unemployed, but they were kept on the books of state enterprises. Accompanying that, there was a quantum leap in worker protests, particularly between 1995 and 1998, which suggests a link between the privatization processes and letting go of these small enterprises and labour unrest and reductions in state-owned enterprise employment. What's interesting is, and you might well say as well, if there was such substantial reductions in state employment during that period, why are we still talking about this? Why is it still an issue? Well, if you look at state employment now in China's economy, it's actually larger, despite all these changes, than it was in 1978. Okay? So if you look at the total, I've given you a table which is total state employees and their proportion by sector, and you can see that, yes, there was a substantial change. So, it peaked in 1995 at around, so that's 149 million, I think. No, 149 billion, I think. Sorry, 14 billion, that's 100 million.